Hello, good morning, greetings, welcome to you all. My name is Kyla Colbin. I am the founder and chief executive of Boma, and it's my absolute honor and privilege to welcome you to this intro to Tiriti for Leaders by Dr. Hana O'Regan. The more I talk to and hear from Hana, the more I want to learn from her. It's this, for me, well, not that unusual, but it's a relationship where I feel like so privileged to like call her friend, but also I'm just like, I love to learn everything that she has to share. She has so much wisdom and depth of expertise, and also grace and generosity in the way that she shares her experience and her insights, her whakaaro. So with that, it is my absolute privilege to welcome Dr. Hana O'Regan. Kia ora, Hana, tēnā koe.
Kia ora, tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou katoa, e toro ake ana ka mihi. Kia koe, Kyla, hoi anō kia koutou katoa o Boma. Me koutou e whakaroko mai nei, so kia ora everybody. Lovely to be here this morning on this, well, I'm beaming at you from Christchurch, so from this beautiful Ōtautahi morning. It's a little bit chilly down here, so I hope wherever you are that you are making sure that you're keeping yourselves warm as well. But if not, let's let the conversation we're about to have warm us up and yeah, get the blood going and just be in the space to have a conversation, a really important conversation about Te Tiriti and the equity challenge that we have in Aotearoa. So thank you, and let's get into it. The first thing I want to do is just set the scene in terms of the conversation. And this is around the question in terms of what Te Tiriti means for leaders and how can we bring around the kōrero, how can we have the engaging conversations that we need to be having with our teams, with our colleagues, with our peers, but also with our whānau and our friends as well. And to do that, we need to unpack what the narratives are that we've heard about the Te Tiriti, but also in the current context, what that means in terms of our understanding about our collective history, and what are some of the things that we haven't had access to that we might not know, and without them makes the conversations even harder to have. So I want to ultimately get to a point where we can start raising the questions around the relevance for Te Tiriti and the kaupapa of equity for your mahi today. And no matter what sphere you're coming at us from today, no matter where you work, I believe that it is important that we not only start to unpack what we know around Te Tiriti and see the relationship to equity, irrespective of our position, irrespective of our role. This is something, just by being here, that is an important thing for us to do. Okay, so to look at the reason why I've merged these two kaupapa of Te Tiriti and equity, my understanding of, I've had a privileged upbringing in many ways, insofar as even if I'd wanted to, I couldn't really escape conversations about our history as a country, where that came from in terms of the history of the time when we were first colonized, and what was happening internationally as well. You know, I grew up in an environment that was rich of all this conversation and a lot of debate, but many people in New Zealand haven't had access to that debate or have only had access to part of that story. And that means that the way we've talked about Te Tiriti, the way we've engaged about it, and even now in the last couple of years, this has been something quite heightened, hasn't necessarily been grounded in an understanding of the wider context and even its history. And that really serves to shallow the debate that we have, shallow the conversation. And we start getting these ideas of things being unfair if Māori are seen to be benefiting from tiriti claims or tiriti settlements, because we think we start melding this idea of equal rights and equity into a context of an agreement, a foundational contract, a foundational agreement that we had that was, again, for our country and set the way we were to be. So really these two things not just merged now, but they've always merged. The understanding of equity, the understanding of our rights, but also how they've played out because of the context of the treaty. But what we seem to have got, to as a country, is that we end up boxing those conversations in a way where we don't look at what the purpose of the history has been, the impact on equity outcomes in our communities by failing to recognize and uphold those commitments that were made. And what we do is we box them in a way that we kind of just push them to the side, and we say that we don't want to, that it's no longer relevant, we don't want to discuss them anymore. So in the next little while, I really want to start exploring what equity looks like so that we can have the conversation about why it's such an important concept, why it's such an important thing to be thinking of and engaging in when we talk about te tiriti, and then how we lead in our roles and in our communities with that understanding. So why focus on equity, on tōkeke? Why do we even need to do this? Well, more recently, you would have heard, if you've been turning the radio on or watching TV, you would have heard conversations around equality, and then almost without a second thought, people interchanging them with the definitions of equity. The confusing thing here is that, or what's not helpful in this context, is that they mean quite different things. So we start to hear a narrative which is really emotive and, draws up all these emotions in us when we say things aren't equal, we deserve equal rights, but we're not actually understanding the difference between these two really important concepts. And as the image here shows, equality is around equal investment and equal input, whereas equity is about, well, what kind of input, what kind of investment is required to have an equitable access to the to different opportunities, but also an equitable access to outcome. So what needs to be put in place for different groups with different situations, different historical contexts, and different experiences to enable more equitable outcomes. Why we focus on it in New Zealand is because we have, and why it's so important to get these two terms, to really understand them, is because we've really struggled as a country to have a conversation where it might challenge this strong view of ourselves as being a country that fights for equality, that really holds it at our heart. So anything that challenges that, anything that it might be presented, where people might say, oh, hold on, that's not necessarily the case if you look at this example and that example, and highlights where inequity comes to the fore, then that can almost be seen like an affront to our culture, an affront to who we are. And we often really struggle with getting into the discussions around it. Instead, we often try and abdicate blame. We say, well, it's that person's fault or that group's fault for the reason that they might be experiencing inequity. Or we blame someone else for doing it. So it wasn't me, it wasn't my family, it wasn't my context, so therefore it's somebody else's fault and therefore somebody else's problem. But it's hard because it does really hit to our core of what we believe in, our sense of justice, and our sense of what is right. So I'm just going to name it, that it's hard. But actually, if you want to lead for equitable outcomes, if you want to lead for equity, and if you want to lead as a leader, really start to engage and understand te tiriti, then we need to go into those places that are harder and to discuss what we see in front of us and also what we might not see in front of us when it comes to equity and inequity around us within our country, within our motu. To do that, we have to think about how our understanding of the conversations have been influenced by what we've heard around us. And I mentioned before the radio or the TV, but it's not just that. It's the information or the narratives, the stories we've heard even within our communities, at our own kitchen tables, or it might be in our workplace. It's important to think, what is our common narrative? And when I say common narrative, that's the idea that we can hear dominating and common themes that come up in more than one place within our communities and in our society. So to really challenge, what is the story that we've heard about Te Tiriti, but also about equity? When it comes to the common narrative, and especially when we start looking at it from an equity perspective, then we need to ask the question, who gets to choose what story we do here? Often the point that we don't go to is then to question who might be potentially being harmed by that narrative. Have we actually stopped to think who gets harmed by those stories, but also who is set to privilege and benefit from those stories that we hear? Now, that seems like a very heavy way to start the morning, the Tuesday morning of the week. And I'm going to intentionally take us into some quite heavy spaces, but hopefully you'll see the goal, which is to actually help us unpack some of these foundational and challenging conversations so that we can get to the point where we can start getting inspired and creative about what we might do about it. So when we talk narrative and we talk about the stories we've heard, it's really important to question why we think the way we do. What has influenced the thoughts, these beliefs that we have about us as a country, the beliefs we have about us and our history, and where they have come from, where that information has come from, what has influenced them. I want to put a rider up, and that's about the importance of not suggesting that people are to blame for a view that they might have, or something they might have said, or a narrative that might be their common narrative, if they haven't actually had access to the full story or another view. And I use this quote from 1994 that was said to me when I was being probably a little bit more emotional and reactive about some explicit racism that I was hearing and seeing. And I was getting really angry about, thinking, how could people possibly say those things and believe those things and think those things? And my father actually turned to me in the way that only a father who is growling you can look at, can deliver. And he said to me, because I challenged him for not being stronger at responding and rebutting these people. And he was, in my view, he was being too calm and too nice. And I was 21 and I was angry, wanted him to get in there. And he said to me, Hana, if you only knew what they only know, you'd probably think the same. Now, I found that as a complete affront to my sense of character as this young 21-year-old who believed that everything I knew was right. But I've apologized to him by quoting him ever since with this quote, because I actually then understood what he meant when he said, if I needed to know my own privilege of the stories and the history that I had access to, and that if I hadn't have had access to that, then potentially I might have been influenced and not had the right questions to ask or the right challenges to respond to by some of that common narrative, which was not necessarily reflective of the whole story. So I want to just name this at this point and say, and this quote, if you only knew what they only know, you'd probably think the same. Because that asks us to, instead of jumping into the emotional self straight away, it asks us to give people the benefit of the doubt. It asks us, and even in terms of leading conversations around equity and te tiriti in your workplace or with your colleagues, it asks us to be generous in our view of others and make sure that they've got the fuller story before we then allow those emotions to come to the fore. So, okay, we're going to get into a little conversation now, and what I'm going to ask you to do is to put your answers into the chat, which means that I need to be really clever and pull up my chat at the same time. Okay, we're there. And I want you to share with me and just write into the chat what your answers are to these questions. I'm not asking you necessarily what you think, but I'm wanting us to explore this idea of this common narrative. So the question then is, what are the commonly known characteristics or emblems of Kiwi identity, of New Zealanders? And when people think about Kiwis, when they think about New Zealanders, what do they think or say? So don't hold back. I would say often that it's a good idea not to necessarily think of what Australians say about us, but anyone else. And sorry for any Australians in the room. It was a bad joke. Okay, so we've got Kiwi, Silver Fern, All Blacks, fantastic. We've got All Blacks a couple of times. Greenstone, absolutely. The Pounamu. Oh, I love that. That she'll be right. The she'll be right attitude. I think you almost have to say it with an accent when you do it. Haka. Yep, the Silver Fern, Jandals, Kiwi Fruit. Flight of the Conchords, Kāpai, down to earth. Nice. And that again pulls on some of the attributes of being Kiwi, what we're known for. Foot Rock Flats, she'll be right attitude, Lord, love it, that we're welcoming. We've got our waiata aringa, our Māori cultural performance and our songs. Middle Earth, I am pretty sure, and we've got hobbits in there, I am pretty sure lots of people think that we walk around with big feet, big furry feet as well. And I'm not judging anyone who's got big furry feet there. Farmers, absolutely, kapai. Adventure, with the adventure kind, bungee jumping. Yes, mountains, thank you, Anna. Sheep's come up again. Conflict averse, interesting, kapai. That was sporty. Beautiful scenery. Is there a line that people come up with when we talk about the beautiful scenery in terms of those common narratives? Rivers, outdoor, and innovative, number 8 wire. Thank you. Yep, innovative again, tramping, inclusive. Once we're warriors, kapai, we'll come to that one as well. 100% pure. Okay, wonderful. Yep, well, the first, thank you, Sarah, the first to give women the vote. And this is one of the things we're known, right? We're the first in many, and when it comes to especially the story of equity, we hold ourselves up being the first, clean green, kapai, Pasifika people. Thank you, Anna. Okay, kia ora everybody. I'm going to just pause there for a minute. Many women PMs and leaders. That's doing a little bit of a look on the list. We've got quite a few wahine on the call today as well. Okay, so how did we go? Let's have a look at what I had here. Something I prepared earlier. And how well did we go? So we've got many of the same things that we have talked about. Here we've got the clean green, and maybe even though many women and PMs as leaders, maybe even that idea with the Christchurch call with Jacinda Ardern leading the world in terms of that, the work on the internet to cut out hate, which wasn't a good way of explaining it, but I think you get where I was going. Okay, first woman giving women the vote, number 8 wire. She'll be right attitude, laid back, Middle Earth, okay. And we had All Blacks. I'm not sure if that meant that we were competing on the global stage, on the world stage. But you can see just from that example that we have, and we've got sheep, we've got jandals even, that was mentioned before. You can see we've got a pretty consistent, a common narrative about how we describe ourselves as Kiwi, but also, even if we don't describe ourselves, how we know we get described, right, as a collective. Perfect, thank you very much. I'm now going to get you to do exactly the same thing, but what I'm going to do is change the word Kiwi to Māori. So what's the story we have for Māori? What are the commonly known characteristics or emblems of Māori identity? And when people think and talk about Māori, what do they say? And just like I said before, I'm not asking you what necessarily you believe and think, but what is the common narrative out there and what gets said. Okay, so we've got haka, singers, entertainers. Kapai, great hospitality, thank you. Warriors, yep, we've got whakapapa, kuru, community and whānau focus, tiki, pounamu. Just happens that I might be wearing one today, although I'm not sure that you can see that far. Connection to whenua, matariki, Kia ora, custodians. Disproportionate, thank you, Sharon, disproportionately represented in prison, generous, spiritual culture, hangi, whānau, mātauranga Māori, so our Māori knowledge systems, poor social well-being outcomes. Thank you, Sarah. Poor health outcomes and life expectancy compared to Pākehā. That tangata whenua, collective values. Loss of Te Reo Māori. Kaitiaki, rongoā, which is our Māori medicine. Tattoos, ka pai. Awesome. So these, and we've got tradition. Sorry, I'm having to go up and down. Tradition. I love that one. I love that one, Nina Cuz. That's pretty cool. Again, poor health statistics. Family values, higher SUDI, which is sudden infant death syndrome. So if I got that the wrong way, but SUDI numbers, yep. Okay, and tikanga. And the stereotypes. Thank you, Kirsten. The stereotypes, gangs, lazy, other negative things. Awesome. And kaitiaki for the taiao. Okay, let's see how we went. Oh, sorry, Ren, I just about cut you off. Once we're warriors, again, the stereotypes from television. Okay, so let's see how we went. We got once for warriors. We actually had hangi, haka, poi, and kuru, and tāmoko, pounamu, and tiki. I think we got absolutely every one of those kind of emblems. But we also got these other ones around the incarceration rates, poor health statistics, and once for warriors. No one said about can all play the guitar or being good at art, but we've definitely got the singers in that in terms of the notions around the performances. But it's all right. You might not have got an A plus, but it's still looking like the grade would be an A in terms of reflecting on the comments back. And I put this up. The reason I do this exercise is to then just show that there's a dominant narrative. And this dominant narrative, this common language that we have, when we have it with being Kiwi, we very rarely have anything that's negative in it. But as soon as we start talking about what people think and talk about Māori, we have this layer of negative. And the challenge is we know that there are many of these statistics which are actually 100% right. But do we have an understanding of where they've come from, how they've occurred? Because if we then start thinking in terms of leaders, and if we're wanting to lead our organisations and again be leaders in our community, in our whānau, and in the places we work, do we then consider what it must feel like to be Māori in our environments, knowing that no matter, and I can tell you, no matter where I go in the country, it doesn't matter if it's the far north or the deep south, and even though a lot of people think that it's only a thing that might happen in Christchurch or some other areas, that this is actually the narrative that people share with me right across the country. And quite a distressing response is that it's also the way that children, when I do this exercise with children, both Māori and non-Māori, they come up with the same set of stereotypes, which tells us just how dominant the narrative is, that we can even come up with the same lines. And so to question then what it feels like, even to be having conversations around issues of equity or issues of te tiriti, when we know that this is there, it's out there, it gets reinforced in the media, it gets reinforced in our systems, it gets reinforced in the communities that we're in, then how does it feel to be in a dairy knowing that people might be holding these views about you, or at least know that there are these views that are held about you, or at your local school, in your neighbourhood, in your workplace? To actually take that step around from here's a narrative and here's an amount of language that might be common, but then to think about, well, who does this narrative privilege and who does this narrative harm, is actually the first step that we need to take when we want to start really getting in to the conversations we know and that we hear about te tiriti and equity. because often we just put it out there and say, yep, well, I don't feel that way. That's not what I see. It's not what I believe. And so we avoid going into those hard conversations. But if, like you have done today, any group that I work with come up with that exact same stereotypes for both Kiwi and for Māori, then we are doing ourselves a disservice to think that that doesn't have an impact on relationships and the way we engage with each other, the way we view each other, and the way we hold each other in our spaces. So how do we get there? Because it's one thing to say, right, well, this sucks. Here we are, we're in this situation. This is the reality of what the conversations are. But what do we know about how we actually got to this point? And that is the most important part of this process in terms of my engagement in these kōrero, in these conversations. It's actually understanding the cause and effect, how we've ended up in a situation where that's our dominant narrative. How have we allowed it to happen? And I'm going to put it out there that the view he iwi ko tahi tātou that has been, you've heard come over the airways more recently again, is and the challenge is that this idea that we all have equal rights in New Zealand, that we are egalitarian, is actually a myth. When we start to unpack how the inequities that we see today have come to be, then we can see that actually there hasn't been equal treatment for groups in our society. And when we look at Māori, that is certainly the case. I'm going to also propose to you that it was intentional. The inequities we see today, or at least the origin of them, what initially caused them and allowed them to be the case, was intentional. Almost sounds conspiracy theorist, so I'm not coming at it from that angle, and I'll give you some examples how. But this narrative that is so dominant that we've been exposed to hasn't just happened. It's not just a recent thing. It's happened across generations, and it's been intentionally designed to support the political, economic, and social outcomes that we see now. It's a big statement, I know. I ask that and suggest that we need to understand the thinking that lies at the foundation of that decision to make these, to deliberately design them into our systems, so that we're in a position for us to be able to identify ways to potentially address them and move beyond the current situation. And the reality is that our systems have their foundations in race-based policies that were explicit, that didn't shy away from even the use of that race terminology, and that those foundations, those race-based policies, that are at the basis of our system, actually profited some, and often dispossessed. At the cost of dispossession and the demise of Māori. So it's understanding them, but if you only see the current statistics and you don't know what's happened, where they've come from, then it's really hard to have that empathy and to understand what we might be able to do about it. So I'm going to give an example. I know some of you might have heard these examples before, but I want to give an example of the intentionality, but also how deliberately those inequities were designed within the context of education. But the same process can be done no matter what area you're speaking about, or which area you work in. So it starts very early, and it's okay. I'm going to jump forward quite a few decades, so it's not a year-by-year account. I always kind of feel like I have to put that disclaimer out. But I want to suggest, as an example of those inequities that we see today, that the channeling of Māori students in our education system into lower paid jobs, into lower professions, was intentional. When in 1862, the school inspector reported to the House of Representatives, this is part of the education policy, it shows just how deliberate it was. He said that a refined education or high mental culture would be inappropriate for Māori because they are better calculated by nature to get their living by manual than by mental labour. That's explicit. It's right out there. that says that Māori shouldn't have an academic progression in education. It should be around manual instruction, and they are better placed in terms of their ability to be in vocation work rather than academic work, because they believed that in terms of being better calculated by nature, that Māori weren't of the same level as non-Māori. I just want to give you a bit of context that at that time, so if we're thinking, within that same time frame, that you are actually more likely to be literate if you were Māori than if you were Pākehā. So we've got the foundations of our education system that say a refined culture would be inappropriate for Māori because they don't have the same ability as non-Māori. And yet at that same period, over 60% of the Māori population were literate in comparison to 22% of the Pākehā population in New Zealand. So it doesn't match up, but what we can see is it was the intent. The intent was not for Māori to be in that space. The reality, again, was that Māori were prolific writers and political commentators at that same time. In fact, from 1842, 2 years after Te Tiriti was signed, right through until 1933, Māori were developing and writing and publishing their own newspapers within their own communities. One of my villages, Moiraki population 4, 5, at one stage it might have been a couple of hundred, they had their own printing press. I mean, it's just amazing that right early on, when most of the country was still struggling with literacy, most of the non-Māori population, Māori were writing these papers that were fascinating, talking about all things around the world, Shakespeare and politics all over the world. And they were doing this within their own Māori communities. And yet, at the same time, we're being told that they're good with their hands, not with their minds. In 1867, when the Schools Act was passed, and the Native Schools Act was passed, this was schools were set up specifically, native schools were set up specifically for the instruction and the education of Māori. It explicitly said that that English was to be the language of instruction, but importantly, that schools for Māori were to focus more on manual instruction than academic subjects. So the idea that everyone, even from the beginning, was having equal access to education was completely wrong. There were schools set up for Māori that were limited in terms of their scope of academic success and in comparison to the schools that were available to non-Māori. We have one school, Te Reo College, a Māori boys' boarding school in the Hawke's Bay and from Te Hauke. And this one college did something quite unique within the context of the native schools. It was so unique that our first wave of Māori academics all came from the same school. We have Sir Maui Pōmare, the first Māori doctor, Sir Peter Buck. He was a doctor, but also a scientist. First indigenous person ever to be appointed to faculty at Yale University. We have Sir James Carroll, who was another lawyer, Sir Apirana Ngata, who graduated, he was the first to ever receive a BA LLB. Now, they all came from this one school because the principal decided that he wanted the boys at the school to have the same opportunities as anyone. He saw the day that Māori would want to have their own clergymen, their own doctors, their own lawyers, their own professionals. So he did what they needed to do. He taught them what they needed to learn to be able to get them to university. And it wasn't English, maths or science. It was French, it was Latin and the classics. Back then, they were considered the most important things. So he taught them and they got into university. And they then went through and succeeded. The problem was that the system wasn't intended. That wasn't the purpose of the New Zealand education system. So it was going against the intent. They didn't have anything to stop it at that stage. So they put a royal commission in place for Te Reo College. John Thornton was put on trial. And the end of that, and he fought vigorously to defend the right for Māori to learn the academic subjects. In the end, the board was sacked. A new principal was appointed. We then see an amendment to the Education Act, which then forbid the teaching of academic subjects in the native schools. It didn't happen by chance, didn't happen because Māori were making choices to go to schools that didn't have access to academic pathways. It happened because our government deliberately put something in place, a barrier in place to keep Māori within the manual instruction and to allow other schools to be able to develop in that way, but not the same entitlements for Māori. And we also see it just shortly after a nationwide policy to impose or legitimise the corporal punishment of children starting speaking Māori in the classroom. They did this to my Welsh and my Welsh, Irish and Scottish ancestors as well. All we did was import the same policy, and that was to take away to kill the language, the native languages of those communities. And you do that, you have it is easier to control the way that the communities operate, and again relegate people to lower socioeconomic positions in society. It wasn't just because they wanted one language, it was part of an international blueprint for colonization. So we start to have a huge impact on this in terms of Māori families then not wanting their children to be beaten when they go to school, and in one generation we see that parents start to stop speaking their heritage language in their homes. But coming back to the intent and the purpose of education, let's jump forward to 1915. The Department of Education, in the annual report, it states, the inspector for the native school states, so far as the department is concerned, there is no encouragement given to Māori boys who wish to enter the learner professions. The aim is to turn, if possible, their attention to the branches of industry for which Māori seems to be suited. Now that's explicit. It's saying even now, after 20 years, they'd seen their Māori leaders go through academic pathways and succeed. And so whānau communities were wanting this for their children. So here we have a deliberate statement to say, if they want to do these things, you need to try and turn their attentions to other industries. And it's explicit. It's not by chance. It's saying that this is the purpose, the expectation of native schools in New Zealand. In 1930 and 31, the New Zealand Federation of Teachers, they stood up. They actually put a petition. It was a large petition to ask and request for the teaching of Te Reo Māori and Māori culture into the curriculum. They saw the effects and the impacts of not having it, and what was happening with the Māori children as well. And they thought it would be something that would add to our curriculum and who we are as a country. But it was blocked by the Director of Education, who at the same time and in the same report said that education should lead the Māori lad to be a good farmer and the Māori girl to be a good farmer's wife. And I always say to people when I'm reading this that I would have made a lousy farmer's wife on all accounts, and I probably would have been sorry for the animals, because I'm pretty sure I would have been lecturing them about Te Tiriti way back then as well. But again, with that, you can see just that was the purpose. That's what it wanted to achieve. By the 1980s and 90s, along with the other legislation that was targeted around creating Māori as as a lower class within society, by the dispossession of land, by the exclusion of equity of opportunity within the economy and so forth, we get to the 1980s and 90s and we start to see a shift in the wording. Now we see, because of that history, that Māori are predominantly in a negative lower socioeconomic position, but we start to see a shift from the policy saying this is what we want for Māori to keep them in these lower positions, and we then start to turn it around to talk about now the socioeconomic and ethnic factors are the reason for the underachievement, not because of the deliberate inequities that we've been putting in place. What we do by then, and by doing so, is we then put the blame on Māori for the position they're in, and we start to hear things like, oh, if only Māori, if only they had books and homes, if only they valued education. We start to, again, bring that narrative of everyone's got an equal chance, but everyone's got an equal chance in education, so therefore it's their fault if they don't do something. But the reality was that that education system was designed for those outcomes, and not just the education system, the whole system. Okay, so let us jump into the chat again. And I want us to think, because that was an example, and I did go into it a bit of at length, so my apologies, but it's an example about education from within an education context. I want you to now just share with me, what is the narrative you've heard more recently about Māori and Te Tiriti in your takiwā? So when what have you heard on the political airwaves about Te Tiriti? And please feel free to write your kōrero in the chat again. So now if we come back to the current situation is what I'm saying, what are people talking about around Te Tiriti? He whakaaro, anyone want to put anything in there? Ka pai, our right to be here. Yep, we've got the Treaty Principles Bill that most people might be opposed to it, and we certainly hear that. Yes, a lot of chat about co-governance, that people wanting to learn more. The Ngāi Tahu FY claim, a freshwater claim, thank you, and Ngāi Tahu wanting to take the water, the people fear of losing something, rangatiratanga, freshwater, the court case in Canterbury, absolutely, that all living in New Zealand should have equal rights, that it's been politicised by both sides, yep, it's been a hot topic around the bill, it's definitely got people talking, mismanagement of water by the Crown, people realise that they have not been taught about the treaty in school, absolutely. People realise that we have the most, okay, racist government ever. I'm not sure. Yep, ka pai. And what Nicole's just said, within our family, there were different conversations happening over different generations. That's interesting, the generational difference. Been needing to chat across the family to build common family understanding. Love it. And it's great to have Aotearoa New Zealand history's curriculum in the schools and libraries. Well, I don't think we're quite there yet, but it's a positive move. Yeah, that's right. That a lot of people say, oh, things are different now to when the Tiriti was signed. And the hikoi has been, if you weren't on the hikoi or witnessed the hikoi, it's certainly been in our living room through the media. Yeah, that we can all stand up for honouring Te Tiriti. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So we're coming to the end of the session. I know it seems to have gone by very, very fast. And I wanted to ask that question as to what people are talking about now. And also acknowledge what you've shared there, that for many people, this has actually been, it's a hot topic, and it's been a topic that's been discussed within our own families. It's quite, and not necessarily a challenge, a loving way. There's been a lot of division within families about the different views. The important thing around Te Tiriti is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, the debate and what we're hearing is almost being fed by another narrative, or that is the intent is to create fear. If we think about the example of education and the purpose of education and what the intent was, think about now what the intent of the messages that that we're hearing now, that is around the creating the divide. And people mentioned about the freshwater rights, or the rights of water. Recently in Christchurch, there was a mail drop by a group pretending to be Ngāi Tahu that said, we are Ngāi, and it was all around Christchurch, saying, we're Ngāi Tahu and we want to take over all of the water in the South Island, and we want to be the full governors of the South Island, and this is what we're doing, and we're going. It was deliberately pretending to be Ngāi Tahu and then putting it into letterboxes. Now you think about what the intent of that narrative is. It's not about understanding, because it wasn't factually right. In fact, that was fraudulent, even in terms of pretending to be somebody that they weren't. And yet the intent, what it was meant to do, was create fear. For all of a sudden things are going to be taken away from me, all of a sudden the world that I know is at risk because these Māori are wanting to, and Ngāi Tahu are trying to rule the world, and what's it going to look like for me when that happens? Not based on, actually, here's the history, here's what people are wanting to do, here's how we want to work together, but creating this real sense of anxiety and fear within our community, which creates division. If we really want to start thinking about the context and the conversations around Te Tiriti and also about equity, we need to do what's right. But it's so important that we know our own story, that we know the full story, and that we're open to having those conversations. That means that we have to commit to reconciling our collective past and acknowledging the historic causes of the inequity, but also the historic causes of what we see now, the trauma and the inequities that we see in front of us playing out, like those statistics that were mentioned in our earlier in our session. It means that we have to commit to addressing the imbalance of power and having the hard conversations. I loved a line that Chloe Swarbrick said around the Te Tiriti Principles Bill when it was first introduced into Parliament. She said, for those accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. For those accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. So it's not that Māori are trying to take over, or like's been purported in the propaganda that's going out, but the idea that we might even think that an equitable response to something is oppression is because we're not yet ready to have conversations around how current power, the imbalance of the current power regimes, and also what it means in terms of how those inequities play out within our communities. So if we want to do what's right and we want to own our own story, we have to have the hard conversations around what's happened and whether or not what we see and we think is just is actually just. But we also need to stop the perpetuation of the divisive and destructive rhetoric and propaganda. It doesn't matter if at one level, if you don't think those negative things, and when we talk about the profiling, the belittling of Māori, or that Māori are, even if you come into that, go back to Māori are kinesthetic learners, good with their hands but not with their minds, you might absolutely not be part, you might not sign up to that way of thinking. That's not who you are, it's not what you think. But if we don't stop those messages in terms of those stories carrying on, what we're doing is we're letting them carry on. We leave them unchecked, and they continue to then impact on the way that people in our community feel, but also the harm that is created from allowing those kōrero to continue. So I believe, no, sorry, I won't break out into song. It is only a Tuesday morning after all. The view that I have, and that those that I work with and have worked with for a number of years now, where we've got to, is that we can actually start breaking down some of these, the way of approaching the conversation, and we can do it in a way where we can get much further if we start thinking about equity in this way, where we look at the equity mindset. What is the lens we need to apply to really start seeing inequities that we might not have otherwise seen in front of us? That requires us to look at what we do, our environment, our values, and our practices, and to do so with an equity lens and identify areas of strength, but also gaps. We then go to equity by design, which means we acknowledge how inequity has been deliberately designed into our system and our practices. And then that then allows us to challenge how we might design for equitable outcomes by identifying what has happened, and we can see where those patterns are so that we can design for an alternative future. And then finally, equity in action. This requires us to implement the strategies and hold ourselves to account for them. This, if you think about it, can also be applied then at Te Tiriti level. What does it take to have a Tiriti honouring mindset? How do we design in a tiriti honouring way? And then what would tiriti honouring look like in action in our own workplace, in our own communities? And finally, and hopefully there'll be a few minutes for questions. I want us to think about it potentially then, what it looks like from what tiriti mindset, what tiriti by design and tiriti in action might look like. And to think of the three, and I know it's not limited to three, but to think of the three principles of te tiriti: partnership, protection, and participation. So in terms of taking it from a partnership approach, within your sphere of influence and control as a leader, how do you ensure that you and those you represent act reasonably and honourably and in good faith? How do you support the equal status of the treaty partners and the need for accountability and compromise in the relationship? In terms of protection, are you aware in your area of specialisation what the historic and current breaches of te tiriti are, where Māori interests have not been actively protected? And do you understand the impact of those breaches on the tiriti partner? And within terms of participation, are you aware of the historical and current inequities of partnership and of participation and engagement for Māori? And in your work, how do you ensure tangata whenua have opportunities to engage with the decision-making processes? E hoa ma, that has been a very fast delivery of this webinar, and I apologise for taking you from the time of te tiriti right through to now in those short minutes, but I do really want to say thank you for the opportunity to do so. And over to you, Kyla, if we do have time for a couple of questions. I'm really keen.
Yeah, kia ora Hana, tēnā koe, kei te mihi ki a koe, ka nui te mihi ki a koe. Thank you so much for that insight, for that whakaaro. We do have just a couple of minutes for a bit of a chat. Before we do that, I do want to flag, of course, this was 1 hour. We have a full day program coming up with you. It's Tiriti for Leaders. It's a 1-day workshop, goes into much more depth, much more detail on the specifics of how we can apply this way of thinking, apply an equity lens, deeper understanding of tiriti. That program is coming up on the 10th of June. We also have one in September. I've just put the link in the chat. One of the critical things about this kind of kaupapa is that it becomes more powerful the more we have friends and allies on that journey with us. And so we do have a 3-for-2 offer for this program. So you can see that link in the chat. Please do come along. It's a very powerful day and really equips us as leaders to be able to engage in these conversations more effectively. On that front, there are a couple of things that have come up through the chat that I just want to flag. One is Anna's comment about her friend in her 70s who recently started a tiriti discussion group at a community center in Pōneke, and people in their 80s are participating because they want to learn more and fill in their understanding. And Hana, you started the beginning of this conversation with the observation that it doesn't matter what our role is and how many people report to us, that we can all engage in this kaupapa. Here's this woman practicing leadership, uninvited, to be able to create this space for people to have this conversation. So I really just wanted to flag that for you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, look, when you haven't had access to a history, when we haven't had all those resources available to us, and coming back to that comment that Dad said, if you only knew what they only know, you'd probably think the same. I think we can often, and understandably, hide away from the conversations and engaging in them because they're hard to go places, especially if we don't know all the history ourselves. But you shouldn't feel bad about that. You shouldn't feel bad about not knowing the history and not knowing necessarily those causes. If you haven't had the opportunity to learn, how could you have? The question, and when you put on an equity mindset or even a te tiriti honouring mindset, what you'd then be doing is asking yourself, do I know enough, or is there other information that I might be able to learn? So I love the idea of the 70-year-old having their own tiriti discussion group. I think it's absolutely fantastic. But you can challenge things by saying, even responding to them, by calling it out, but you don't need to be the expert. You don't need to have a doctorate in it. You can say, hold on, I think there might be another side to that story. I'd really like to actually go away and can we have that conversation and see if there's something that might be feeding it because it doesn't seem consistent with what I've heard. That can be even a rider that checks people to say, actually, I don't feel quite comfortable with where you're going. But it celebrates being a learner, that now if we do have access to it, then it's taking the action to actually learn a bit more and prepare ourselves to have those conversations and to help those around us on the journey.
Yeah, amazing. The thing of approaching this with curiosity and approaching this with going, if someone says something that strikes us as maybe out of line, to come back at that with, that's interesting. I wonder where that would come from. I wonder what the cause of that might be. There was one thing that Sharon commented when you were asking about what we've heard about Tiriti, about this narrative that all in New Zealand should have equal rights. And I read a study once that talked about the dominant value of each country. And in the US, the dominant value was freedom. And in Aotearoa, the dominant value is fairness. And one of the things that's been interesting about the Tiriti conversation is that it's been the people who are for the treaty principles bill frame it in the context of fairness. When I think when we understand more deeply, if fairness is our ambition, when we understand more deeply, we go, actually, what is fair is upholding a commitment to a contract that was signed by two parties. What is fair is upholding the opportunity for self-determination and expression that all human beings are entitled to, and that this particular group of human beings has had suppressed in a very particular way. So I just wanted to share that comment from you. We've got
yeah, look, and I know we're running out of time, so look, really quickly, absolutely, I think, and I agree, I think that at the core of who we are as a country, that equality and equity is actually really important. The fact that we haven't had access to the information necessarily around the inequities really jolts our sense of who we are and who we want to be. And that's why I think give people the benefit of the doubt, because when you actually see that even now there are not the same laws that apply to Māori than non-Māori. Māori land is treated differently. It's got far greater limitations on it. We don't have an equal society now in terms of the manifestation of that with our laws and our policies and our practices. So, I think that if we can understand that there has never been equality of treatment, then you're in a better position where you can say, okay, well, yeah, equality is huge for us, and this is something that we should hold on to. And so we shouldn't just justify not honoring agreements and commitments and contracts and sales and all those kind of things that happen with a partner because they're Māori and therefore we don't have to, and therefore it's unfair because we wouldn't apply that same principle to any other group. So I think if we can get there, we can be better, we'll be much better at being the people we want to be and the people that I believe as a country we can be. We just need a bit of a hand getting there.
There we go. Well, that brings us to the end of our hour today. Thank you so much. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much, everyone, for spending your sacred, precious, non-renewable time with us this morning. Please do have a look at the one-day workshop. It is really a kind of mind-blowing, world-rocking day that we get to spend with Hana and improve our own leadership with respect to Tiriti and equity. Thank you, everyone, for joining. That's us for today. Kia ora.
Thank you, everybody. Kia pai te rā. Have an awesome day.